The skyline of Dallas shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Maddox Tower, its sharp silhouettes slicing through the golden light of late afternoon. From the corner office on the top floor, Carter Maddox stood in silence, hands in his pockets, his jaw set tight. The city had changed in the decades since he arrived, a fresh college grad with nothing but a scholarship, an old laptop, and a chip on his shoulder. Now, at 52, he was one of its titans. Maddox Tech Solutions, MTS for short, wasn't just a company, it was his legacy. His blood, sweat, and sleepless nights were etched into every floor tile and polished surface. Yet, all he could feel in this moment was the cold, rising anger brewing in his chest as he stared at the video playing on his phone screen. A champagne bottle popped, laughter erupted. The camera panned across the deck of a private yacht, floating somewhere off the coast of Cabo. In the middle of it all, wearing oversized sunglasses, a designer bikini, and a smug smile, was Brooke, his daughter, his only daughter. She leaned into the camera holding a glass high. "Why work?" she said with a wink, "when you can just be born rich?" The video cut off. Carter exhaled through his nose and locked the phone screen, tossing it onto the polished mahogany desk with more force than necessary. It skidded to a stop next to a framed photo. A much younger version of himself, holding a toddler in his arms at a company picnic. She'd been barefoot, cheeks round with baby fat, blonde hair tangled in a bow. That version of Brooke had laughed freely, unburdened by the life that was yet to come, unburdened by privilege. He remembered the day vividly, her tiny arms around his neck, the look of pride in her eyes when she called him daddy in front of his employees. That little girl had disappeared somewhere along the road, replaced by a 23-year-old influencer with a massive following, unlimited access to wealth, and zero sense of responsibility. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Maddox?" Mia Landon's voice came through crisp and composed. "The board is assembling." Carter pinched the bridge of his nose. "Tell them I'll be there in 5. "Yes, sir." He straightened his blazer, ran a hand through his graying hair, and grabbed the presentation folder off the desk. The one Brooke was supposed to co-present. The Pathways Initiative, an outreach program aimed at bringing tech education to underserved rural communities, had been her first real responsibility. He'd built it with her in mind. He'd handed her every resource, assigned her a team, promised the board that she'd lead it with vision and purpose. She'd bailed, again, just like the charity gala in New York, just like the investor brunch last quarter, just like everything that required more than a selfie or a filter. Carter stepped into the hallway, nodding politely at passing staff. The walls were lined with reminders of his journey, photos with presidents, magazine covers, awards for innovation. None of it mattered now, not when he was watching his daughter throw away everything he had built, not just the company, but the principles he lived by. The boardroom was a sleek glass enclosure overlooking downtown. Inside, the top brass of MTS sat around a gleaming black table, Mia at his right, CFO Marcus Delaney to his left, and 6 other department heads flanking the sides. Carter launched into the presentation. His voice was steady, controlled. The numbers, projections, and partnerships rolled off his tongue with polished precision. Years of practice, years of knowing how to perform. But when Janet Reese, a sharp-eyed board member from the Midwest, spoke up, it cut through the pretense. "Wasn't your daughter scheduled to present the Pathways segment?" she asked, tapping her pen against her notes. "The community partnership angle?" "She sends her regrets," Carter said tightly. "Our outreach director will be stepping in." There was a moment of silence. "I hope everything's all right," Janet said, eyebrows raised just enough to let him know she didn't buy it. "Fine," Carter lied. "Everything's fine." After the meeting, Carter retreated to his office and locked the door. He didn't sit. Instead, he opened Brooke's Instagram page. Champagne, sunsets, designer clothes, hashtags like #Shchichar, billionaire baby. No worries, just waves, and the one that made his stomach turn. Born to play. The comments were flooded with fire emojis and heart eyes. Not a mention of the initiative, not a word about her responsibilities. Just adoration from strangers who had no idea what she'd failed to do. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Mia. "We have a problem," she said without greeting. Two major Pathways donors saw Brooks' latest post. They're pulling out. They think the whole project's a PR stunt. Carter closed his eyes. How much? Conservatively, $4 million, possibly more, depending on media fallout. He hung up without responding. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky over Dallas turned from gold to purple, Carter was still in his office, staring at the same picture, the same little girl on his shoulders, the same memory of a time when he still believed he could be both a CEO and a father. He knew what he had to do. He made a call. The voice on the other end was older, warmer, a deep drawl that hadn't changed in 30 years. "Hank Callahan," the man answered. "Hank, it's Carter." A pause, then, "Well, I'll be." "Haven't heard from you since, what, Diana's service?" "Yeah," Carter said quietly. "It's been too long." There was another pause. "Something wrong?" "I need a favor," Carter said, looking out over the city that had given him everything, except the tools to raise his daughter right. "A big one." The next night, Carter pulled into the circular driveway of Brooks' high-rise penthouse in Uptown. The valet had already stepped back, intimidated by the black car and the presence of Maddox's security chief just behind him. From inside, music pounded. Bass rattled the windows. The doorman looked overwhelmed and slightly ashamed. Carter didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs. The door was propped open with a sculpture, likely a loan from one of his art investor friends. Inside, the party was in full swing. Lights pulsed. Laughter echoed. Someone was mixing cocktails at the bar he'd imported from Italy. A couple made out against the wall, oblivious. Brooks stood on the balcony, center of attention, laughing as she raised her glass. When she spotted her father, she blinked, momentarily thrown. "Daddy," she said with exaggerated cheer, "didn't expect you tonight." "Everyone out," Carter said, loud but calm. There was a beat of silence, then giggles, then protest. He turned toward the crowd. "You have 5 minutes to leave, or I call the police. There are cars downstairs. Use them." Security began ushering people out. Some grumbled. A few looked nervous. Brooks' friends scattered like birds startled from a wire. "You're embarrassing me," Brooke hissed. "No," Carter said. "You've done that all by yourself." The place was nearly empty when Carter finally sat on the leather sofa and looked at his daughter. She stood with her arms crossed, chin high, face flushed with defiance. "I'm done," he said simply. "With what?" "With pretending this is working, with pretending I've done right by you. I gave you everything except the one thing that mattered: structure, discipline, purpose." Brooks scoffed. "You're going to ground me? I'm 23. "You're going to Clearwater Valley, Idaho," he said, "to Hank Callahan's dairy farm, for 1 month. No phone, no credit cards, no staff, no shopping. Just work." She stared at him, then burst out laughing. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack. You can't make me." "You're right," he said, "but you have a choice. 1 month there, or you're cut off completely. The apartment, the trust fund, everything." Her jaw dropped. "You wouldn't." "Try me." Silence fell between them, thick and electric. Finally, she said, "Fine. You want to make me your little farm girl? I'll go. I'll shovel cow crap and eat baked beans or whatever it is you think I need to learn. But when I come back, I want everything returned. Every dime, every privilege." "You'll get what you've earned," he said. She stormed off. He stayed seated, watching the lights of Dallas blink in the distance, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, or the only choice he had left. At dawn, the jet waited on the tarmac. Brooke climbed aboard, arms folded, sunglasses hiding her bloodshot eyes. Carter said little, but as the engines roared to life and the skyline of Dallas faded behind them, he allowed himself a single thought. Please, let this work. The private jet sliced through a curtain of early morning clouds, its polished wings catching slivers of light that had yet to fully stretch across the sky. Below, rolling hills and dense pine forests blanketed the terrain of Clearwater Valley, Idaho, a place that felt like it belonged to another century. Brooke Maddox sat stiffly in a leather seat, her arms crossed, legs tucked beneath her in defiance. Her pristine white tracksuit, oversized sunglasses, and designer weekender bag screamed Beverly Hills. The faint smell of jet fuel seeped in from the cabin, mixing with her overpriced perfume and tension. She hadn't spoken a word since takeoff. Carter sat across the aisle, reading something on his tablet, though it was clear he hadn't turned the page in 15 minutes. He glanced up now and then, watching her from behind expressionless eyes. When the pilot's voice came through the intercom, "We'll be landing in 10, he finally cleared his throat. "You should change into something more practical," he said. "It gets muddy out there." Brooke didn't move. "I'm not getting out," she muttered without looking at him. He sighed, lowering the tablet. "Brooke, you agreed. Number," I said. "Fine," she replied icily, which, as you know, is rich girl code for, "This is stupid, but I'll play along." Carter didn't flinch. "You need this." "I need a therapist," she snapped. "Not a field trip to cow country." He let the silence settle again. Outside the window, a valley unfurled, lush meadows still clinging to a light morning mist, snow-capped mountains in the distance, and the occasional dirt road winding between fences and fir trees. It looked peaceful, picturesque. But to Brooke, it was a postcard from hell. As the plane taxied down the narrow airstrip, little more than a stretch of gravel wedged between trees, Brooke leaned toward the window. A battered red pickup truck sat near the edge of the runway. A man in a wide-brimmed hat leaned against the hood, arms crossed, boots dusty. A golden retriever sprawled beside him in the shade. Brooke groaned. "Tell me that's not our ride." "That's Hank," Carter said, "and if we're lucky, he brought coffee." "You're not even staying?" "I have meetings in Boise this afternoon." She stared at him. "So you're dumping me with strangers and vanishing?" "They're not strangers. Hank Callahan is family in every way that matters. I spent half my childhood on that farm." "Oh, that explains so much." Carter stood as the door opened, a rush of cold, pine-scented air rushing into the cabin. Brooke stayed seated until a crew member politely motioned her to exit. When she stepped outside, her heels immediately sank into the soft gravel. She cursed under her breath, grabbing her carry-on with more force than necessary. The wind whipped at her hair as she stomped toward the truck. Hank smiled as they approached, his face weathered and sun-lined, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Well, I'll be. Carter Maddox in the flesh, still looking like he belongs on the cover of Forbes." Carter chuckled and stepped in for a firm handshake. "Hank Callahan, still allergic to anything with buttons, I see." "Never saw the point in dressing up for cows," Hank replied. Then he turned toward Brooke. And this must be the infamous Brooke. She offered a tight-lipped smile, tugging her sunglasses down just enough to make eye contact. "Charmed, I'm sure." "If you say so," Hank said without offense, reaching for her bags. "You travel light?" Brooke gestured toward the rest of her matching luggage set, 6 pieces total. Hank whistled low. "Might be a tight fit in the truck, but we'll manage." Another door opened, and a woman stepped out of the cab. Mid-50s, auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt. She had a kind face, stern but kind. "I'm Sarah Callahan," she said, extending a hand. "Welcome to Clearwater." Brooke hesitated a beat before accepting. "Thanks." "Your room's ready. We put some extra towels out." Brooke blinked. Towels. It hadn't hit her until now that she'd be living with them. Not a hotel. Not even a guest house. Carter leaned in to say goodbye, but Brooke stepped back. "Don't," she warned. "Just don't." He nodded, keeping his distance. "This is your chance, Brooke. Don't waste it." She looked away, jaw tight, then climbed into the truck's passenger seat without another word. The dog in the back huffed as if in agreement. The drive into Clearwater Valley was long, winding, and bumpy. The paved road gave way to gravel, and then to packed dirt. Cell service bars blinked in and out until they disappeared completely. Brooke kept her earbuds in, though nothing played. It was just her last act of resistance. "You'll like it once you settle in," Sarah said kindly from the back seat. Brooke didn't reply. "You know, I remember when Carter was your age," Hank added. "Mouthy, stubborn, hated the smell of manure. And now, look at him, runs the world." "Good for him," Brooke mumbled. The truck crested a hill, and the Callahan Dairy came into view. Brooke's heart sank. It looked like a scene from a history book. A white farmhouse with chipping paint and a porch that sagged slightly to the left. 2 red barns sat to the east, one of them leaning like it had given up on standing straight. Fences framed grazing cows, and chickens strutted through the yard like they owned the place. And mud. So much mud. "This is it?" she asked, incredulous. "Home sweet home," Hank said cheerfully. They parked in front of the house. Hank and Sarah moved quickly, unloading bags, while the retriever barked once and disappeared toward the barn. "Jake should be around somewhere," Hank said. "My nephew. Helps me with the farm. Good kid." Brooke stepped down from the truck, sinking again into the ground. She yanked her suitcase wheels through the muck, her attitude as heavy as her bags. The screen door creaked open, and Jake Callahan walked out onto the porch. He looked nothing like she expected. Tall, broad-shouldered, in worn jeans and a tee damp with sweat from morning chores. His hands were calloused. A baseball cap shaded his eyes, but even from a distance, Brooke could see the skepticism written all over his face. He sized her up like someone inspecting a broken tractor. "This her?" he asked Hank. "Sure is." Jake whistled low, unimpressed. "She's gonna last. 3 days, tops." Brooke narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me?" Jake ignored her. "Let me guess. Won't touch dirt, allergic to cows, and thinks almond milk comes from tiny nut faucets." "You're charming," Brooke shot back. "Must be all the cow dung in your bloodline." "Better than whatever's clogging yours," Jake muttered, then grabbed 2 of her bags with ease and headed inside. Brooke turned to Hank and Sarah, appalled. "Is he always like that?" "Only when he's awake," Sarah said, unbothered. Brooke followed her new hosts up the porch and into the house. It smelled like coffee, wood polish, and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon. The floors creaked, the ceiling fans whirred, and the walls were lined with photos of people who actually looked happy to be here. Sarah showed her to the guest room upstairs, small, clean, and plainly furnished. No flat screen, no marble countertop, no heated toilet seat. "This is cruel and unusual punishment," Brooke muttered. Sarah just smiled. "Breakfast is at 5. Work starts at 5:30. There's a pair of work boots by the door." "I don't do mornings," Brooke said flatly. "You do now," Sarah replied with the kind of calm certainty that could only come from raising kids, or calves. Brooke stood by the window after they left, looking out over a horizon that had no skyscrapers, no noise, no Wi-Fi, no escape. Down below, Jake walked past the barn with a shovel slung over one shoulder. He glanced up briefly, caught her watching, and smirked. She yanked the curtains closed. This was her life now. No phone, no perks, no control. Just dirt, and cows, and 1 month of hell to prove her father wrong. She swore to herself she'd hate every minute of it. But deep down, a tiny flicker of something else stirred. Not curiosity, not wonder. Just the first faint crack in the wall she'd spent years building around herself. And that's where it all began. At precisely 4:37 a.m., the rooster crowed, loudly. Brooke Maddox sat up with a start, the unfamiliar sound ripping her out of a deep, NyQuil-assisted sleep. Her head pounded, and her mouth felt like sandpaper. She reached for her phone out of habit, but it wasn't there. Just a wooden nightstand with a doily and a chipped lamp. For a moment, she had no idea where she was. Then she remembered Idaho, the farm, the punishment. She groaned and fell back onto the pillow. Another rooster call, closer this time, was followed by a distant, rhythmic clanging, like metal striking metal. Maybe it was a cowbell, or a death knell. She rolled over and buried her face in the pillow. 10 minutes later, there was a knock. "Brooke." Sarah's voice floated through the door, chipper and unreasonably awake. "Time to rise and shine, honey. Breakfast is in 10. Work starts right after." Brooke groaned again, but louder, like maybe she could scare Sarah off with sheer willpower. It didn't work. A few minutes later, she trudged downstairs in black leggings, an oversized hoodie, and Gucci slides, designer loungewear, barely worn, very much not farm appropriate. Her hair was tied in a haphazard bun, and she had applied just enough mascara to feel somewhat human. She paused at the bottom step. In the kitchen, Hank, Sarah, and Jake were already seated around a wooden table that looked like it belonged in a Cracker Barrel gift shop. Steaming plates of scrambled eggs, thick slabs of bacon, and biscuits the size of her fists sat in the middle of the table like a Norman Rockwell painting. Jake glanced up and smirked. "Look who decided to join the land of the living." Brooke glared at him and pulled out a chair with exaggerated slowness. "Eat up," Sarah said warmly. "You'll need it." "I usually just do a smoothie," Brooke mumbled, picking at the corner of a biscuit. "Chia and oat milk." Jake snorted. "We got regular milk. Comes from cows." Brooke shot him another look, but he was already focused on shoveling eggs into his mouth like it was a sport. She picked at the food, avoiding the bacon entirely, and sipped on black coffee that tasted like burnt earth. When breakfast wrapped, Sarah handed her a folded bundle of clothes. "You'll need these today, and there's a pair of boots by the door. They should fit." Brooke frowned, unfolding a pair of faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and thick wool socks. "I brought clothes." "Not for this kind of work," Sarah said with a knowing smile. 15 minutes later, Brooke stood on the porch in borrowed jeans that were too loose, a flannel shirt that smelled like lavender detergent, and a pair of old boots that clunked when she walked. She looked and felt like someone's Halloween costume idea of a farmer. Jake met her near the barn, already elbow-deep in feed buckets and hay. "Wow," he said, giving her a slow once-over. "You clean up like a scarecrow." "Do all Idaho boys have this much charm, or are you specially trained in being unbearable?" He chuckled. "You'll warm up. Eventually." The sun was still dragging itself over the horizon as Jake handed her a pair of gloves. "You'll need these." "For what?" "We're starting with the milking parlor. That's where the magic happens." Brooke blinked. "Like, milking cows, milking cows?" "No," Jake deadpanned. "Like metaphorical milking. Yes, milking cows. Come on, princess." He led her through a heavy wooden door into the milking parlor, which, despite her expectations, wasn't as chaotic as she imagined. Rows of large, black and white Holsteins stood calmly in their stalls, munching away and occasionally flicking their tails. The air was warm and filled with a mix of smells: hay, sawdust, manure, and something slightly sweet. "Meet the girls," Jake said. 60 of them. Each one needs milking twice a day, every day, no holidays, no sick days." Brooke stared at the animals in mild horror. "They're bigger than I thought." "They usually are." Jake approached one of the cows and motioned for her to follow. "We'll start with Buttercup. She's mellow." He demonstrated the process, cleaning the udder, checking for any signs of infection, then attaching the milking cups. The machine hummed to life, and milk began flowing through clear tubes into a stainless steel container. "Simple enough," he said. "You're up." Brooke took a hesitant step forward. The cow turned its head slightly, eyeing her with what she swore was judgment. She reached out with the cloth Jake had given her and dabbed at the udder like it might explode. "Gotta be firmer than that," Jake said. "You're cleaning, not applying moisturizer." Brooke frowned and tried again, this time pressing more confidently. "Good," Jake nodded. "Now check for any swelling or heat." "I have no idea what that even means." "You'll learn." By the time she got to attaching the milking equipment, her arms were already sore. She fumbled with the tubing, accidentally letting one of the cups slip, and got sprayed with milk. "Oh my God," she shrieked. Jake laughed. "It's just milk. It's not lava. This is disgusting. It's breakfast." The next hour was a blur of awkward motions, spilled milk, and near disasters. Brooke managed to step in something she really hoped was just wet hay, pinched her finger in one of the hose clamps, and nearly tripped over a water line. Twice. By the time they finished with the last cow, she looked like she'd been through a minor war. Her hoodie was streaked with mud, her hair had escaped its bun, her gloves were soaked, and she was sweating. Actually, sweating. "How we feeling?" Jake asked with a smirk. "Like I'm about to sue my father for emotional abuse." Jake chuckled and leaned against the barn wall. "That was the easy part." Brooke groaned. "What's next?" "Goat wrestling." "Stall cleanup." She stared at him. "You're kidding." I wish. The next phase involved a pitchfork, a wheelbarrow, and an overwhelming amount of manure. Sarah showed up midway through and gave her pointers on proper shoveling form. Jake teased her for using the pitchfork like a pool cue. Brooke, in turn, nearly hit him with it. By lunch, she had managed to fill 3 wheelbarrows worth of muck, trip once, and lose 1 boot in a particularly sticky patch of ground. Jake had to pull it out for her while she balanced on one leg like a flamingo in distress. When they finally walked back to the farmhouse, Brooke collapsed onto the porch steps, panting. "Was that even legal?" she asked. Jake handed her a bottle of water. "Welcome to day 1. She took it, chugged half, and stared at the sky. "You said this was the easy part." "It is," he said with a grin. "Tomorrow we start fence repairs." "Oh, joy." Sarah appeared with a tray of sandwiches and sweet tea. "Eat something. You'll feel better." Brooke picked up a sandwich with shaky hands. It was turkey and cheese on homemade bread, and despite her exhaustion and a weird streak of cow hair on her sleeve, it tasted like heaven. Later that evening, after a lukewarm shower and a failed attempt to remove the manure smell from her hands, Brooke collapsed onto her bed. She pulled out the small journal Sarah had left in the nightstand drawer. "For reflection," she'd said, and opened to the first page. She stared at the blank sheet for a long time before finally writing, Day 1. Farm prison is worse than I imagined. Jake is smug. Cows are terrifying. I'm sore in places I didn't know had muscles. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. And there are 29 days left. God, help me. She closed the book, turned off the lamp, and sank into the mattress. The barn smell clung to her hair. Her arms ached. Her nails were ruined. But despite it all, a strange sense of pride stirred somewhere deep inside her. She'd made it through the day. Barely, but she had. The 4th morning came before Brooke Maddox had any right to be awake. The rooster crowed as expected, but by now it had become less of a rude awakening and more like a miserable alarm clock with feathers. Brooke rolled over in bed, groaning into the pillow, sore in places she hadn't known existed. Her arms ached from hauling feed the day before. Her legs screamed from chasing down a runaway calf. Even her hands, once only useful for swiping on screens, throbbed under the blisters now forming beneath her borrowed gloves. The Callahan farm was starting to wear her down, not in the way she expected. Physically, yes, she was wrecked. But something else was happening too, something she didn't want to name just yet. After splashing cold water on her face and tying her hair into a no-nonsense ponytail, Brooke trudged downstairs in her usual borrowed flannel and loose jeans, her boots thunking against the floorboards. Sarah greeted her with a smile and a hot plate of biscuits, eggs, and hash browns. "You're getting faster at getting ready," Sarah noted, setting a mason jar of peach jam on the table. "Mostly because I can't sleep anymore," Brooke muttered, rubbing at a smudge of dirt she hadn't even noticed on her cheek. Hank grunted his approval as he sipped his coffee. "That's the farm working its magic. You'll be dreaming about tractors in no time." Jake walked in a minute later, face flushed from the early barn chores. "She'll be dreaming about cow patties and broken fences more likely." Brooke didn't even flinch at the jab. "You jealous I look this good covered in mud?" He paused for half a second before smirking. "Sure, that's it." They had fallen into a strange, antagonistic rhythm over the past few days. Brooke threw barbs, Jake threw them back. Neither flinched. But lately, there had been something else lingering behind the sarcasm. A shift. It wasn't quite respect, but it also wasn't pure disdain anymore. After breakfast, the day's tasks were laid out. Fence repair on the south pasture, helping Sarah with calf care, and a supply run into town. The fence work came first. Brooke followed Jake out with a pair of wire cutters slung awkwardly in her hand and a coil of fencing over one shoulder. She was still getting used to the gear, the gloves, the heavy boots, the fact that work jeans didn't flex like leggings. "Try not to cut your fingers off," Jake said, walking a few paces ahead. "No promises," she replied, tightening her ponytail. "But if I do, I'll bleed in the shape of a hashtag." He barked out a laugh, real, not sarcastic. That was new. When they reached the pasture, the damage was easy to spot. A section of the wooden fence had collapsed, likely from a storm earlier in the month, and one of the cows had been smart enough to exploit the weakness and make a break for it the day before. They worked side by side in the drizzle, the sky gray and moody. Brooke held posts steady while Jake hammered them in, each strike echoing across the valley. Her arms shook from the effort, but she gritted her teeth and didn't complain. Not once. "Not bad," Jake said, glancing over as she tightened wire around a post. "You're improving." "Thanks. I aim to be Idaho's Miss July in the fence repair calendar." He smirked again, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes. "You really never had to do this kind of thing before?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Brooke paused, pressing a foot down on the base of the post. "I grew up in private schools, nannies, housekeepers, tutors. I didn't even know we had a laundry room until I was 15. Jake gave a low whistle. "So this is, what, boot camp for the rich?" "Something like that." She leaned back, wiping her brow. "I guess my dad got tired of me being the family embarrassment." Jake didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "You're not an embarrassment." Brooke blinked. "What?" He shrugged. "You complain a lot, but you're still here. Most people would have quit by now." "I tried," she said under her breath. They finished the fence repair just before noon, mud streaking up the sides of her jeans. As they trudged back toward the barn, the rain started falling harder. Big sloppy drops that clung to every surface and turned the dirt paths into slippery messes. Inside the calf barn, Sarah had towels waiting and 2 bottles of warm milk. "Meet your new best friends," she said, gesturing toward the calf pens. "They'll make you earn every drop." Brooke stepped inside cautiously. She'd seen the calves before, but hadn't really spent time with them. They were gangly and wide-eyed, with legs like stilts, and ears that twitched when they breathed. One of them trotted over immediately and bumped her leg with its wet nose. "Whoa, personal space, little dude," Sarah chuckled. "That's Daisy. She likes you." "She likes the bottle," Brooke muttered, but she couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. Feeding the calves was surprisingly peaceful. They butted and nudged with surprising force, eager for their meals. Brooke had to brace her knees against the fence to stay upright, but she found herself laughing at their impatience. They were loud, clumsy, and relentless, and weirdly adorable. Jake poked his head in at one point, leaning against the barn door. "Not bad, city girl." "Don't jinx it," she said, adjusting the bottle. After the feeding, Sarah handed her a soft bristled brush and showed her how to groom one of the older calves. Brooke worked slowly, brushing in smooth strokes, while the animal leaned into the touch like a sleepy dog. Sarah watched from a few feet away, arms crossed. "You've got a gentle hand," she said. "Animals know when someone's calm. They sense it." "Must be broken," Brooke replied. "I'm a walking anxiety spiral." Sarah smiled, unfazed. "Maybe not as much as you think." That night, Brooke sat in bed with the journal open in her lap. She'd started writing in it regularly now, not because Sarah had asked her to, but because it helped. She didn't know what to call the feelings growing inside her. They weren't comfort exactly, not yet, but they weren't just anger either. She scribbled, "Day 4, rain sucks. So does fence repair, but the calves don't hate me. Jake might hate me less. Sarah's probably a saint. Still want to leave, but maybe not as much as before." She paused, tapping the pen against her lips. "Also, I kind of liked brushing Daisy. Don't tell anyone." She closed the journal and turned off the lamp. In the quiet, she listened to the rain tapping against the roof, the occasional moo from the barn, and the creak of old wood settling for the night. Somewhere in that quiet, her mask slipped a little more. She didn't know it yet, but the girl who had once lived for Wi-Fi, filters, and private parties was starting to care about things that didn't need a hashtag. Cows, fences, rain, conversations without pretense. The farm was reshaping her, slowly, stubbornly, and with the same kind of patience it took to coax a skittish calf into trusting your hand. And for the first time, Brooke wasn't just surviving the experience. She was beginning to understand it. The storm arrived like a whisper before it became a roar. That afternoon, the sky over Clearwater Valley dimmed into a bruise-colored haze. Thick clouds rolled in from the west, dragging behind them a strange, heavy silence that swallowed the usual farm sounds. No birdsong, no lowing cattle. Even the wind paused, as if bracing for impact. Brooke was in the calf barn when it started. She had just finished brushing Daisy, who had taken to nudging her whenever she stopped for more than 10 seconds. A low rumble shivered through the ground beneath her boots. She looked up. "Thunder," she muttered, stepping toward the barn's open side door. A second, sharper crack followed, and this time the walls trembled. Jake appeared in the doorway, already pulling on his rain jacket. "Storm's rolling in fast," he said, glancing at the sky. "Hank wants everyone inside for a quick meeting." Brooke nodded, setting the brush down and following him out into the thickening wind. They jogged across the yard toward the farmhouse, boots slapping wet earth as fat droplets of rain began to fall. Inside, Sarah had a small emergency map unrolled across the kitchen table. Hank stood at the head of it, pointing toward an area marked East Pasture. "That creek's already swollen from snowmelt," Hank said. "If this downpour keeps up, it's going to breach and sweep straight toward the equipment shed and maybe the south fencing line." "Do we have sandbags ready?" Jake asked, already pulling gloves from a drawer. "Behind the main barn. We'll need to move fast." "Brooke." Hank looked over at her. "You ever filled a sandbag before?" "Nope," she said, catching her breath. "But I'm a quick learner." Jake raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Sarah handed them both thermoses of hot coffee and wrapped a plastic poncho around Brooke's shoulders like armor. "You'll want this more than you think," she said, "and take extra socks. Wet feet end in misery." Within minutes, the three of them were racing toward the barn. The rain had turned to a steady downpour, thick and relentless, drenching the ground and turning every step into a squelch. By the time they reached the sandbag stacks, Brooke's sleeves were soaked through and her hair clung to her face like ivy. But she didn't complain. They set up an impromptu line, Jake shoveling wet sand into the bags, Brooke tying them shut, Hank hauling and stacking them along the outer wall of the equipment shed. It was backbreaking work. Each bag was heavy, awkward, and the mud sucked at their boots with every step. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the valley in stark flashes of white. Brooke's arms burned, her fingers ached, her face was speckled with sand and rain. She didn't stop. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, save for the occasional grunt or shouted instruction. The wind howled around the buildings, bending trees and sending loose tools skittering across the yard. By the time the wall was half finished, Jake looked over his shoulder. "We've got another problem," he said, breath visible in the cold air. "The creek's already over the lower ridge." "What about the heifers?" Brooke asked without thinking. Jake blinked. "You remembered the new herd. They're in the lower East Pasture, right? If the water rises anymore, they'll be trapped." Hank didn't hesitate. "Jake, you and Brooke get the ATV, round them up and drive them toward the West Hill. I'll check the drainage culvert and see if I can redirect anything." "You're sending me with her?" Jake asked, not out of doubt, just surprise. "You said she's been pulling her weight," Hank replied. "Now's her time to prove it." Jake didn't argue. They sprinted through the rain toward the shed and fired up the ATV, its engine coughing before roaring to life. Brooke climbed into the back, clutching the side rail as they tore across the pasture. The world was chaos. Wind and water lashed at them, the tires slipping on the soaked grass. When they reached the lower field, it was worse than Jake had feared. The creek had breached fully, water racing through the grass like a miniature river. The heifers, about a dozen younger cows, were huddled on a raised patch of ground, panicked and mooing loudly. One of them tried to move, stumbled in the rushing current, and nearly went under. "Get the gates open," Jake shouted. "We're herding them up the slope." Brooke didn't wait. She jumped down, her boots plunging into ankle-deep water, and struggled through the current toward the nearest gate. The metal was slick, the chain rusted, and her gloves slipped once before she managed to yank it free. "Open!" she called, voice hoarse. Jake leapt down and began circling the herd, waving his arms and shouting. The cows resisted at first, confused and skittish, but instinct took over. Brooke moved behind them, clapping and whistling, trying to mimic what she'd seen Jake do. It worked. One by one, the animals began to move. The youngest calf, a tiny brown one barely a week old, stumbled, legs trembling in the water. Brooke moved instinctively. She sloshed toward the calf, wrapped her arms around its chest, and lifted. It was heavier than it looked, all bone and muscle and slick fur, but she didn't let go. "Keep them moving," she shouted at Jake, who was driving the group toward higher ground. "I've got this one." She carried the calf 10 yards uphill, every muscle screaming, her feet slipping more than once. When she reached dry grass, she collapsed to her knees and cradled the calf in her lap. Its breathing was fast, but steady. "Easy," she whispered, running her hand over its soaked coat. "You're okay. We've got you." Jake jogged over seconds later, eyes wide. "You picked her up?" She couldn't walk. He stared at her for a long moment. "You didn't have to do that." "She needed help," Brooks said, wiping rain from her eyes. "You would have done the same." They stayed there for another minute, catching their breath, until Hank's voice called from across the pasture. "Culvert's stable. For now, let's get these heifers into the barn." They guided the herd toward shelter, moving more slowly now that the worst had passed. The calf Brooke had rescued wobbled behind them, sticking close to her side. By the time they made it back to the barn, the storm was finally starting to ease. Rain still fell, but softer. The wind no longer screamed. Inside, the barn was warm and dry, filled with the soft sounds of cattle settling down. Brooke sank onto a hay bale, water dripping from her jacket, her arms still trembling. Jake knelt in front of her, holding something in his hand. A small wooden carving, a 5-pointed star about the size of her palm. He offered it to her. "What's this?" "She saved that calf," Jake said. "She gets a name." Brooke smiled. "Hope." Jake nodded. "Then this is yours." She took the wooden star, fingers closing around the smooth grain. It was simple, humble. It meant everything. That night, Brooke lay in bed, the star resting on the nightstand beside her journal. Her clothes were drying near the stove downstairs. Her body was exhausted. Her brain was still spinning. But her heart felt something she hadn't in a long, long time. Purpose. She opened the journal and wrote, "Day 5. I carried a calf. I helped save a herd. Jake gave me a carved star. Her name is Hope. I think it fits. I don't know what's happening to me, but for the first time, I don't want to run." She turned off the lamp. Outside, the wind was quiet again, but inside her, something new was just beginning to rise. The morning after the flood broke over the valley like a sunrise through storm clouds, quiet, golden, and clean. Mist clung to the ground, curling above the fences and grazing pastures like steam rising from the land's exhausted body. It was as if the earth itself had exhaled after a night of barely holding it together. Brooke stepped outside the farmhouse, with a coffee cup cradled in both hands, still in her flannel and rubber boots, her muscles aching from the day before. The carved wooden star, Hope's star, hung from a twine string around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt, close to her skin. She looked across the field toward the barn where Jake was already moving hay bales, his silhouette cutting a sharp shape against the pale blue sky. He worked like the storm had never happened, steady, quiet, focused, as if that was the only way he knew how to move through life. Brooke had seen him different during the flood, though. Fast, decisive, afraid. That fear had matched her own. And for the first time since she arrived, they'd fought the same battle, not on opposite sides, but shoulder to shoulder. That meant something. Inside, Sarah was making pancakes and humming to herself, her auburn hair braided down her back like always. She smiled at Brooke as she came in, nodding toward the kitchen table already set for 3. "How's the body holding up, farm girl?" Brooke snorted softly. "I think my spine is filing a complaint with HR, but I'm good." Sarah poured syrup into a mason jar and sat across from her. "You were incredible yesterday. That calf wouldn't have made it without you." "She just looked at me," Brooke said, poking at her plate, "like I was the only thing between her and drowning. I didn't think, I just moved." "That's how you know you're meant to be in a place," Sarah replied gently. "When your instincts line up with what the moment needs." Brooke sat back, staring out the window. "This place keeps changing me, or maybe revealing me. I'm not sure which." Sarah reached for a second cup of coffee. "Maybe both." After breakfast, she and Jake worked in near silence, fixing gates, checking fence lines and hauling straw to replace what the rain had ruined. The rhythm of it all, the physicality, the routine, the quiet companionship, felt grounding, like the world didn't need to be spinning fast to feel like it was moving forward. It was around midday when Jake brought out the tablet. "Hey," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You mind taking a look at this interface again? The data's stalling on the low-end nodes. I think it's choking on the loop." Brooke blinked. "Wait, those are your field sensors?" "Yep. Soil saturation, moisture levels, basic salinity tracking. Nothing fancy, but if we can automate pasture rotation and irrigation, we'll stretch every drop of water through the next drought." Brooke sat beside him on the barn's workbench. "You built this whole system?" Jake shrugged. "I'm using it for my thesis, remote agri-tech monitoring. Most farms around here don't have access to the kind of tech your dad's company makes, so I'm trying to make a version that runs cheap, off recycled processors." Brooke scrolled through the UI. The logic was clean, but his scripts were a little clunky. "You're doing all the hardware and firmware yourself?" "Mostly, but software's where I get stuck. I don't code like you people from the city." Brooke raised an eyebrow. "You people?" Jake gave her a half smile. "I mean the ones with data science degrees and espresso bars on every block." She chuckled. "Well, allow me to bring a touch of overpriced coffee culture to your humble barn." She pointed at the screen. "Here's your choke point. It's trying to run predictive models on incomplete hydration tables. We can smooth the interpolation curve." Jake blinked at her. "That actually makes sense." Brooke grinned. "You sound surprised." "I didn't think you'd actually care." Brooke's smile faltered. "I didn't either." Later that day, they drove to the far edge of the property to test the system's new calibration. On the way, Jake pointed out where Carter had grown up. The old farmhouse long gone, but the tree line still marked the spot. "He used to ride a dirt bike along this fence line," Jake said. "Told me once he'd race the sun to the top of the ridge." Brooke's brows lifted. "My dad? Dirt bikes?" "Your dad was wild back then. Brilliant, but wild. He once built a home radio transmitter from scraps and convinced me we could tune into air traffic control." Jake chuckled. "We almost fried half the barn's wiring." She laughed, genuine, bright, loud enough to startle a hawk from a fence post nearby. Jake smiled, but grew quieter. "We all thought he'd stay, take over the farm, marry some girl from town, but the day he got that scholarship to Georgia Tech, he was gone, never looked back." Brooke stared at the horizon. "I always thought he hated this kind of life, that he worked so hard just to never come back to it." Jake paused before speaking again. "He didn't hate it, he loved it, but he wanted to change the world, and you can't do that from a pasture." Brooke didn't answer. The wind blew across the fields, rustling dry grass like whispered memories. That evening, she pulled out her phone, which had sat unused for days. There was still no signal out here, but near the house, if she stood on the back porch and tilted it just right, she caught a single bar of service. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Then she typed, "Why didn't you ever tell me you grew up this way?" She hit send before she could change her mind. The reply came minutes later. "I wanted you to have more, but maybe I gave you too much of everything but the truth." Brooke stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Back in her room, she opened her journal and wrote, "Day 6. He raced the sun. He built radios in barns. He wasn't always a boardroom shark. He was a boy with mud on his boots and ideas in his hands. And he gave me everything, except this part of himself. Maybe I needed to come here to meet the parts of my father I never knew existed, and maybe the parts of myself I never let breathe." She closed the journal and reached for the carved star again. Hope. She held it tight as she drifted to sleep. Outside, the sky was clear, the stars so sharp they looked painted onto the dark. And for the first time in her life, Brooke Maddox didn't dream about mansions or parties or fame. She dreamed of fences, of calves, of a field lit golden in the morning light, and her father, young, grinning, tearing across that ridge like he could outrun the world. The morning broke with that crisp kind of silence, only found in places untouched by traffic, phones, or obligation. It was the kind of silence that asked for stillness, for listening, and Brooke Maddox, who once couldn't sit still through a 2-minute guided meditation app, was learning how to hear it. She stood at the edge of the Callahan's north field, a clipboard in one hand, a stylus in the other, and her boots planted firmly in the soft, uneven soil. The prototype of Jake's water monitoring system was up and running. For the past week, she had poured every ounce of her attention into refining the code, simplifying the data interface, reducing the power draw on recycled parts, and building out a mobile access version that didn't require state-of-the-art hardware. Jake had called it a miracle with a coffee-stained laptop and duct tape. Brooke called it her first real contribution to something that mattered. Standing in the field now, watching the solar sensors blink green across the pasture grid, she felt something crack open in her chest, not in a painful way, but like a door being unlatched. Purpose, that's what it was. Not borrowed prestige or curated relevance, just the honest feeling of doing something that had tangible impact. She was still adjusting the moisture threshold in the software when she heard the sound of tires on gravel. Her head lifted. A sleek black SUV crested the hill just past the silo and rolled to a stop in front of the farmhouse. The Maddox crest on the driver's door glinted under the sun. Her father had arrived. Brooke's breath caught for a second. She hadn't expected him so soon, especially not without a week's notice and a calendar invite. She looked down at herself, jeans smudged with soil, a faded flannel tied at her waist, hair pulled back beneath a dusty ball cap. No makeup, no filters, no armor. She started walking back toward the house, each step tightening the coil in her stomach. Carter Maddox stepped out of the SUV, wearing dark jeans, a button-down shirt, and polished boots that had clearly never met a puddle. His sunglasses masked his expression for a moment until he removed them and looked directly at her. Brooke stopped a few feet away. "Hey." He smiled softly. "Hey." They stood like that for a beat, the space between them thick with words neither had said in years. "You're early," she said, folding her arms. "You said next weekend." "I had business in Helena. Thought I'd check in." Brooke arched an eyebrow. "Spontaneity doesn't sound like you." Carter looked around the farmyard, taking in the neatly repaired fencing, the new calf pen, and the buzzing irrigation monitor on the barn wall. "I didn't want to wait," he said simply. Jake emerged from the barn just then, nodding a greeting. Mr. Maddox Carter extended a hand. "You must be Jake. Heard a lot about you." "Likewise," Jake replied, giving Brooke a sideways glance. "We were just about to calibrate the north node. You want to see what your daughter's been working on?" Carter glanced at Brooke, a question in his eyes. She gave a small nod, then led him toward the prototype display. As they walked, she started explaining. Not nervously, not trying to impress, but with the kind of clarity that comes from actually knowing what you're doing. "We've optimized for lower-cost processors and off-grid power. The data isn't just moisture levels. It's about trends, efficiency. This system could save struggling farms thousands of gallons in irrigation waste." Carter studied the display, brows furrowed. "You coded the logic layer?" "Jake built the hardware. I built the brain." Carter looked at her. Really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. "I'm impressed." Brooke glanced away, heat rising in her cheeks. "It's not finished. There's still a lot we want to field test." "Still," he said, his voice low, "you found something here, didn't you?" She swallowed. "Yeah," she whispered. "I did." They walked the fence line for a while. Brooke pointed out how the new rotation strategy was working, how the herd was healthier and the grass more resilient. "This is the stuff you never told me about," she said suddenly. "About what this place was. About you." Carter's face tightened. "I didn't think you'd want to know. You always hated when I talked about the past." "No," she said softly. "I just didn't know how to listen." They stopped at the old oak tree that marked the center of the property. Carter leaned against the trunk. "I used to climb this tree every morning before chores. Told myself I'd see the whole world one day." Brooke looked up at the branches swaying in the warm breeze. "And you did." "Yeah, but somewhere along the way, I forgot how much this world mattered too." He pulled a small packet from his jacket. some papers, a brochure with the Maddox Tech logo. I brought this in case you're ready to come back. There's a position still open for the Social Impact Division. No pressure, just a conversation. Brooke took the packet, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she turned and looked back toward the barn, where Hope, the calf she'd saved, was sunbathing lazily near the fence, her coat glossy under the morning sun. I have a different idea, she said. Something new. Carter raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. She took a breath. You always talked about tech solving real problems, right? What if we built something specifically for rural America? A whole wing dedicated to small farms, real data, real tools, stuff people like Jake and Hank can actually afford. Not just charity, innovation with impact. Carter didn't speak right away. Then, Agritech. Yes, Brooke said, eyes bright, and I want to lead it. Carter stared at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. You're serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I think we can make that happen. She exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. I'll have to go back to school, she added. I want to finish my degree, maybe take some ag courses, learn from both worlds. And you'd split your time? Between here and Dallas, she confirmed. Clearwater Valley isn't done with me yet. From behind them, Jake's voice carried across the field. You two done making world-changing plans, or should I come back later? Brooke turned and smirked. You wish you were this influential. Carter chuckled, surprising even himself. He's a good one. Brooke nodded. Yeah, he is. That evening, they had dinner together on the porch. Carter stayed longer than expected, laughing with Hank and Sarah, listening to Jake talk about his thesis. For once, he wasn't the richest man in the room. He was just another guy with mud on his shoes and a daughter who had started to find her way back. As the stars came out and the night settled soft around them, Brooke sat on the porch swing with Jake. She rested her head on his shoulder for a moment, watching fireflies blink in the field. I don't want to lose this, she said quietly. You won't, Jake promised. You're part of it now. She turned and kissed him, just a small thing, brief and quiet, but honest. When Carter stood to leave the next morning, Brooke hugged him longer than she had in years. I'm proud of you, he said softly. Not for the project, for choosing to become someone new. Brooke nodded, blinking back tears. You were right. Something had to change. I just didn't know it had to be me. Carter smiled, then climbed into the SUV. Jake walked her back to the porch. You sure you'll survive a week in the city? He teased. Brooke smirked. You kidding? I'll be begging for cow manure by day 3. They both laughed, and for once, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The morning after Carter's visit, the air felt different, lighter, like some invisible weight had been lifted. Brooke stood in the kitchen of the Callahan farmhouse, sipping coffee by the window as the sunlight filtered in through the gingham curtains. The familiar smells of bacon and fresh bread filled the space, but today they mixed with something new, a sense of momentum. She turned towards Sarah, who was pulling a tray of muffins from the oven. I'm heading into Boise with Jake later, Brooke said, biting her lip. We're meeting my dad for dinner. Sarah didn't miss a beat. Sounds fancy. It's not just dinner, Brooke said, nerves flickering beneath her casual tone. I'm going to pitch something big. Sarah glanced over her shoulder. Bigger than showing that boy he was wrong about you? Brooke laughed, soft and warm. Much bigger. Jake appeared in the doorway minutes later, clean-shaven and freshly showered, rare form for a weekday. He looked almost startled to see Brooke not covered in hay or mud. You clean up nice, he said, smirking. She tossed a dish towel at him. Don't get used to it. They loaded into Jake's old truck just after 10, the proposal file tucked safely in Brooke's tote bag, nestled between her laptop and a backup battery pack. As the miles rolled beneath the tires, her nerves grew. I haven't pitched anything since my dad's gala 4 years ago, she said, staring out the window. That fundraiser where you got drunk and tried to auction off your purse? Jake asked, deadpan. She winced. That was a vintage Chanel. Still had gum wrappers in it. Shut up. He grinned and reached over to squeeze her hand. You've got this, seriously. By the time they arrived in Boise, her dad was already waiting at the restaurant, a quiet, wood-paneled place with dim lighting and white tablecloths. He stood as they approached, looking unusually casual in a navy sweater and slacks. Brooke, he said, hugging her briefly, then extending a hand to Jake. Good to see you again, son. Jake nodded. Thanks for meeting us here. They sat near the back, away from the lunch rush, and ordered quickly, Brooke too nervous to care what ended up on her plate. She took a deep breath, glanced at Jake, and opened her laptop. Okay, she said, here's what I've been working on. Carter leaned forward, his expression instantly sharpening. It was the same look he gave in boardrooms when someone had his full attention. I want to propose a new division inside Maddox Tech, agri-tech innovation, focused specifically on tools and solutions for small, independent farms, not just donations, real, scalable systems that solve water management, soil health, and rotational grazing challenges. She clicked through a few slides, photos of their water sensors in the field, Jake's equipment schematics, test data. We've already developed a beta system, she continued. It's cheap, solar-powered, easy to install, and collects real-time data without needing a fiber line or a high-end processor. And it's all based on your early rural diagnostic code. Carter's brows rose. From the East Africa Drought Initiative. We reverse engineered it, Jake said, adapted it for Rocky Mountain terrain and limited bandwidth. Brooke leaned in. This isn't charity, it's a market, a massive one. There are thousands of family farms in the US alone. Most of them can't afford the tech that's out there now, but if we build something for them, not just around them. She trailed off. Carter sat back in his chair, silent, processing. Jake added, We're not asking for millions up front, just startup funding, enough to finish testing, launch open source blueprints, and get pilot programs into 5 partner farms by the end of the year. Carter finally spoke. And you want to lead this? Brooke nodded. Not as your daughter, not as a face on a brochure. I want to finish my degree, online if I have to, take some agricultural science courses, spend half my time in Dallas and half here. I've already talked with the registrar. Carter steepled his fingers. And Jake? I'm staying on the farm, Jake said, but I'll be the tech liaison, and I'll finish my thesis using the field data. For a long moment, no one spoke. Brooke's heart pounded. Then Carter smiled, slowly, almost like it surprised him. I always knew you had something in you, he said, but this is beyond anything I hoped for. Brooke let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So you're saying yes? I'm saying I want the full proposal on my desk by next Friday, and I want you in the office in 2 weeks to present to the executive team. Brooke beamed. Deal. They clinked water glasses instead of wine. For the first time in years, their conversation didn't veer into arguments or silence. It moved, fluid, curious, present. When dinner ended, Carter stood and pulled Brooke into a hug, this one longer, tighter. I'm proud of you, he whispered. Brooke smiled against his shoulder. Thanks, Dad. As they stepped outside, Jake slipped his arm around her waist. I still can't believe you just walked into that meeting like a boss, he said. Brooke laughed. I think I scared myself a little. They drove back to Clearwater Valley under a sunset sky, the mountains painted orange and lavender. As they passed the turnoff to Callahan Farm, Jake slowed. Wait, he said. One more thing. He pulled the truck into the pasture entrance, parked, and reached into the glove compartment. Brooke raised an eyebrow as he handed her a small envelope. What's this? Your official farm nickname, he said. She opened it. Inside was a Polaroid of her standing next to Hope, both of them covered in mud and grinning. On the back, in messy handwriting, Brooke Mud Queen Maddox, Clearwater certified. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped it. That's going on the company website. Please don't, he groaned. She kissed his cheek. Too late. As they drove the last mile home, the porch lights of the Callahan house flicked on ahead, warm and familiar. Brooke looked down at the Polaroid in her lap, then out at the stars beginning to appear overhead. She hadn't just found a project. She'd found a future she actually wanted. The days that followed Brooke's proposal passed in a blur of purpose, packing, and prolonged goodbyes. Though she would be returning, this departure felt like the end of a chapter she hadn't realized she was writing until it was almost complete. That morning, the kitchen buzzed with quiet energy. Sarah had been up since before dawn, baking cinnamon rolls from scratch, just because. The smell alone felt like a hug. Brooke sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and watching sunlight warm the weathered floorboards. "You sure you've got everything?" Sarah asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Brooke nodded. "I triple-checked, then checked again." Sarah poured her a second cup. "You're gonna do great things. You know that, don't you?" Brooke gave a sheepish smile. "Some days I believe it." "Believe it every day," Sarah said firmly, "even on the hard ones." Moments later, Hank entered the kitchen in his usual Carhartt jacket, though today it looked unusually clean. "I wanted to give you something before you head out," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Been working on this for a while." He pulled out a small, hand-carved pendant, another wooden star, this one slightly larger than the one Jake had given her after the flood. The center was etched with the outline of Idaho's state shape, with a tiny heart carved into the spot where Clearwater Valley sat. Brooke blinked, caught off guard. "Hank, it's beautiful." He shrugged. "You earned it. Don't matter how you showed up here. It's how you showed up since." She slipped the pendant over her head. "I'll wear it whenever I pitch the Agritech division. Let folks know I've got real dirt under my nails." "Well," he said with a small grin, "you'll be the fanciest farmhand the valley ever produced." As the sun climbed higher, Jake backed his truck into the drive and began loading the last of Brooke's things, her now weathered suitcase, a canvas duffel, and a cardboard box filled with keepsakes, photos, Sarah's patchwork quilt, her worn-in boots. The entire community had turned out for a farewell bonfire the night before. It had started with hot dogs and s'mores, but ended in teary speeches and impromptu stories from neighbors Brooke barely knew, but somehow felt connected to, like Mrs. Langley, the retired teacher who remembered Carter as a bookish farm boy with big dreams, or Tom Fletcher, who still used a tractor Carter helped rebuild in high school. One of the teenagers from town stood up and said, "When she first got here, we thought she was just some spoiled city girl. But now, I don't know, she's one of us." And just like that, the nickname stuck, the farm girl from LA. Brooke laughed through tears as she hugged her way around the fire circle. Jake had stayed close that night, never too far, never saying too much, but always within reach, just the way she liked it. Now, as they stood in front of the truck, preparing for the final goodbye, Sarah pulled her into a tight hug that smelled of cinnamon, earth, and love. "I meant what I said," Sarah whispered. "This place'll always have room for you, no matter how far you go." "I'll be back in a month," Brooke said, "to check on Hope. And the sensors, and, make sure Jake hasn't fallen into a grain silo." Sarah chuckled, squeezing her tighter. "We'll keep him upright till you return." Hank gave her a firm handshake that turned into a bear hug at the last second. "Make us proud, kid." Brooke climbed into the passenger seat of Jake's truck, looking out the window as the farmhouse grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Her hand touched the pendant at her neck instinctively. "You okay?" Jake asked. Brooke nodded. "It's weird. I thought I'd be relieved to go back. But this place, I think it became more home than anywhere else I've ever lived." Jake kept his eyes on the road. "That's what Clearwater does to you." They reached the top of the hill overlooking the valley, the same hill where, just a few weeks earlier, Brooke had first looked out across the farmland with defiance and disbelief. Now, it was awe that widened her eyes. "You're quiet," Jake said. "I'm trying to take a picture in my mind," she replied. "One I'll remember when I'm stuck in traffic back in Dallas." Jake smiled. "I've got something for that." He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small wooden box, the kind that looked like it had been crafted with care and maybe a little stubbornness. He handed it to her wordlessly. Brooke opened it. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. "Brooke, this is the full water monitoring system documentation. You've got everything you need to bring it to life. See you soon. Jake." Her eyes welled with tears. She closed the box and looked over at him. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," he said, "so you don't forget where it started, or who started it with you." She leaned over and kissed his cheek, softly, deliberately. "I'll be back, and when I am, we're installing version 2. Jake gave her that crooked smile she was starting to love. "With mud boots on, I hope." By the time they reached the edge of Boise, where Carter's driver was waiting, Brooke felt a mixture of readiness and reluctance. She stepped out of Jake's truck and turned to face him. "This isn't goodbye," she said. "I know," he replied. "It's just, see you after funding closes." Brooke laughed. "God, I love how you talk dirty to me." Jake rolled his eyes but grinned. "Now go build your empire, Maddox." She nodded and stepped into the SUV. As they pulled away, she waved through the window until Jake was just a shape in the rear view. Carter glanced over from the driver's side. "You okay?" Brooke looked ahead. "I think I'm finally becoming who I'm supposed to be." They drove in comfortable silence for a while until Brooke opened her bag and pulled out the carved star pendant, holding it between her fingers. "You were right, you know," she said, "about something needing to change." Carter nodded slowly. "Sometimes the hardest thing to admit is that the person who needs to change most is us." She smiled. "Don't get too soft on me, Dad." He chuckled. "Too late." That night, in her sleek Dallas apartment, Brooke unpacked slowly. Her once pristine designer wardrobe felt oddly out of place, like costumes from another life. She folded Sarah's quilt and laid it across the back of her couch. She set the carved star on her bookshelf beside her college textbooks. Then, from her tote, she pulled out the mason jar of honey from the Callahan's hives and placed it gently next to her iPad. Her two worlds, side by side, finally integrated. She took a photo of it, no filters, no captions, and posted it to her nearly forgotten social account. Turns out the sweetest things in life come from dirt, bees, and a little hard work. Within minutes, the comments began to pour in. But Brooke didn't check them. Instead, she opened her laptop, inserted Jake's flash drive, and began drafting the full proposal for the Agritech Innovation Wing. Line by line, from scratch, every detail shaped by sweat, love, and everything Clearwater Valley had taught her. 2 weeks after returning to Dallas, Brooke Maddox had settled into a rhythm that surprised even herself. Mornings no longer began with silk sheets and lazy scrolling through curated feeds. Instead, they started with coffee brewed strong, emails to engineers, budget projections, and Zoom calls with agricultural co-ops across the country. Her desk, once a landing zone for PR kits and designer shopping bags, now held soil nutrient charts, grant applications, and her well-worn field notebook from Clearwater Valley. The carved wooden star Jake had given her sat proudly next to her laptop, a quiet reminder of where she had started and why she couldn't afford to stop. Carter's office had given her a corner space with a view of downtown Dallas and a whiteboard that was already filled top to bottom with scribbled system diagrams and team roles for her new division, Maddox Agritech Initiative. The name had been her idea. The mission was simple: bridge the digital gap between modern technology and small-scale farming. But the heart behind it, that came from Clearwater Valley. Brooke had just finished a pitch deck for a USDA grant proposal when her phone buzzed with a call from her father. "You got a minute?" he asked. "Always. What's up?" "I just got off the phone with the team in Helena. Your presentation from last week? The State Ag Board wants to discuss pilot funding for 6 rural counties. They were impressed." Brooke blinked. "Seriously?" "They used words like visionary and field-driven. You're doing something real here, kid." She felt the smile creep across her face before she could stop it. "Thanks, Dad." There was a pause, then his voice softened. "Dinner tonight? My place? Just us?" Brooke hesitated for only a second. "Yeah, I'd like that." That evening, over grilled salmon and garden salad, both suspiciously homemade, Brooke and Carter talked with a warmth that had eluded them for years. They shared memories of Diana, Brooke's mother, remembering her strength, her wit, and her grounding presence that had been missing for too long. "I think she would have loved the farm," Brooke said, picking at her salad. "She always said she wanted to retire somewhere with chickens." Carter laughed. "And goats. She wanted a goat named Pickle." I never understood it. Brooke leaned back, her face lit with amusement. She was so weird, in the best way. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Brooke reached into her bag and pulled out the carved star pendant with the Idaho shape. She's part of all of this, you know, she said, even if I didn't realize it before. Carter nodded. So are you. Later that night, in her apartment, Brooke stood at the window, looking out over the glittering lights of Dallas. The city hummed beneath her feet, a world away from mud-stained boots and calf barns. And yet, she didn't feel far from that world at all. On her desk sat a quilt folded neatly beside a mason jar of clear water honey. Her laptop displayed the first field report from Jake: soil readings, water retention rates, calf growth metrics. And at the bottom of his email, one simple line: "Miss ya already. Don't wait too long to come home." Brooke smiled, clicked reply, and typed, "Already booked my flight. You'd better have Hope cleaned up by the time I get there." She hit send and stood, stretching her back. Her inbox pinged again, but she ignored it this time. For now, she needed to breathe, to step away. She walked over to her bookshelf and opened a small carved box Hank had given her before she left. Inside were notes from her final days on the farm, messages from Sarah, the neighbors, and even 2 local school kids who had helped her test the sensors and wrote, "Thanks for making our cows happy." She pressed her hand over her heart. This was legacy, not a spotlight, not a headline, but a quiet, honest contribution to something bigger than herself. And that was the difference. 3 weeks later, Brooke was back in Clearwater Valley, wearing jeans that now fit like a second skin and boots that no longer pinched her heels. She stepped off the plane with a duffel bag, her laptop, and a head full of project updates. Jake was there waiting, leaned against his truck, arms crossed, grinning like he'd been standing there for hours just to get it right. "Look who's back," he said. Brooke dropped her bag and wrapped her arms around him. "I missed this place," she whispered. "I missed you more." They drove back to the farm with the windows down, wind in their hair, silence filled only by the occasional glance and smile. As they crested the familiar hill, the valley opened up before them, lush, green, and pulsing with life. At the Callahan farmhouse, Sarah and Hank were on the porch, waving. "Looks like dinner's ready," Jake said. "I hope it's not grits again," Brooke teased. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're the one who ate 3 bowls last time." "I was being polite." "Sure you were." They climbed the steps, and Sarah pulled Brooke into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and home. Inside, everything was as she remembered, maybe a little cleaner, maybe a little more hers. That night, after dinner, they lit a small fire in the back pasture. The stars stretched wide overhead, unencumbered by city haze. Brooke sat on a blanket beside Jake, watching Hope, the calf, nuzzle her mother near the fence. "Hey," Jake said, nudging her shoulder, "you remember what you said the first week you got here?" Brooke laughed. "Which time?" "I said a lot of dramatic things. You called it farm prison, said you'd rather do jail time than another milking shift. Guilty as charged." He looked at her seriously. "Still feel that way?" Brooke took a long breath, looked out across the fields, and shook her head. "No," she said. "This place, this work, it saved me. Or maybe it reminded me of something I forgot I had. Either way, I'm not going anywhere." Jake leaned in and kissed her, a soft, confident kiss that said, "This is right." And it was. Weeks later, back in Dallas, the Maddox Agritech website launched with a new photo on its front page. Brooke Maddox stood in the middle of a sunlit field in Clearwater Valley, holding a tablet in one hand and a wooden star around her neck. Behind her stood Hope the calf, nuzzling her boots. On her desk, beside her, a mason jar of honey shimmered in the morning light, right next to a tablet loading field data from 5 rural pilot farms across the country. Brooke looked at it all and smiled. Home wasn't one place. It was the life she'd built between 2 worlds. And now, she was just getting started. Brooke Maddox arrived in Clearwater Valley kicking and screaming, figuratively and literally. She came with heels, hashtags, and a suitcase full of attitude. But the farm didn't care about any of that. It only spoke in early mornings, calloused hands, and the kind of work that doesn't come with likes or filters. What started as a punishment became a purpose. She didn't just learn how to milk cows or fix fences. She learned how to show up for something bigger than herself, to build instead of perform, to listen instead of broadcast, and most importantly, to reconnect with the parts of her father and herself that had been lost somewhere between privilege and pressure. In the end, Brooke didn't just leave Clearwater with mud on her boots. She left with a mission, a vision, a future rooted in real impact, not just inherited wealth. And maybe that's the heart of this story, that sometimes the life you need most is hiding in the exact place you tried hardest to avoid. That humility, community, and hard work can shape us more deeply than luxury ever could, and that second chances aren't found in boardrooms or beach resorts. They're born in barns, stormy nights, and the arms of people who choose to see the best in us even before we do. So now it's your turn. What did you think of Brooke's journey? Would you survive a month on a working farm? Or maybe you've had your own experience that taught you the value of starting over. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Let's talk growth. Let's talk grit. Let's talk redemption. And hey, if this story moved you, made you laugh, or gave you something to think about, hit that subscribe button. We've got more powerful stories coming your way about farmers, families, second chances, and the quiet kind of courage that changes lives. Don't miss the next one. You never know. It might just change yours. See you in the next chapter.